September 1944, near Bayeux, Normandy. Unterfeldwebel Fritz Müller stood at attention, hands clasped behind his back, certain he understood what was about to happen. After 3 days as a prisoner of war, he and his 4 kitchen comrades expected the standard protocol: interrogation, documentation, transfer to a distant POW camp, hard labor, separation from their unit, perhaps shipment to Britain or America. Everything Nazi propaganda had prepared them for regarding Allied treatment of prisoners. Instead, the British lieutenant was pointing at their goulash cannon, the wheeled field kitchen German soldiers affectionately called Gulaschkanone, and asking through an interpreter if they could prepare dinner. Not just for themselves, for everyone. British soldiers, other German prisoners, even nearby displaced French civilians who had gathered near the British encampment seeking food. Müller stared at the lieutenant, certain he had misunderstood. The interpreter repeated the request in German. The other 4 cooks exchanged glances, confusion visible on their faces despite their attempts at military bearing. "You want us to cook?" Müller asked slowly, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. The British lieutenant nodded matter-of-factly, as if this were the most normal request in the world. He explained through the interpreter that his unit, the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division, had outpaced their own kitchen staff during the rapid advance eastward following the successful Normandy landings. They were all hungry. The Germans clearly knew how to operate their equipment. It seemed practical. The concept violated everything Müller and his men had been told for 4 years. Stories of Allied cruelty, starvation rations for prisoners, vindictive treatment, barbarism. The propaganda had been consistent and emphatic. Yet here stood this lieutenant, speaking in measured tones, treating them not as despised enemies, but as professionals who possessed a needed skill. This moment, this single, unexpected request, would begin one of World War II's most unusual arrangements, an arrangement that would challenge deeply held prejudices more effectively than any propaganda campaign. An arrangement that would demonstrate how shared meals could create understanding across enemy lines. An arrangement that would eventually involve over 200 German cooks feeding British troops across Northwest Europe, and would influence post-war culinary traditions in ways neither side could have anticipated. Let me tell you about the moment when both sides realized that hunger, not ideology, would determine how enemies treated each other. About the mathematics of military kitchens that made this arrangement inevitable. About the professional bonds that formed over steaming kettles and shared meals. About what happened when practical necessity overrode years of propaganda. About the day German cooks discovered that their captors were nothing like what they'd been told, and British soldiers discovered that their enemies were, fundamentally, just men who knew how to cook. When the British 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division captured Müller's unit during the push eastward in September 1944, they found something unexpected among their regular prisoners: infantrymen, artillerymen, and the occasional officer. They found a complete Heeresverpflegungsamt provisioning office detachment, 5 trained cooks, 3 fully operational field kitchens, and supplies meant to feed a German company for a week. Military records from September 1944, preserved in the British War Diary of the 50th Division, confirm this unusual capture. The entry reads, "Captured German field kitchen with personnel intact. Equipment serviceable. Decision made to utilize same for immediate improvement of food situation." This wasn't specifically outlined in any military handbook. There was no protocol for employing enemy cooks to feed your own troops, but it reflected something fundamental about British military culture in 1944, pragmatism in the field. The British Army had been fighting for 5 years. British officers and NCOs had learned that survival often depended on practical solutions rather than ideological purity. If you captured functional equipment and trained personnel, you used them. The bureaucracy could sort out the paperwork later. The German field kitchen, the Feldkochherd, represented remarkable efficiency in mobile catering. These weren't improvised cooking arrangements. They were precision-engineered systems designed for warfare. Each kitchen was designed to feed 125 to 150 men from a single unit. The wheeled design allowed these kitchens to literally prepare meals while moving. 2 large kettles, each holding 65 liters, could produce soup, stew, or coffee for an entire company. German military specifications, documented in Wehrmacht quartermaster manuals, required these kitchens to begin serving hot food within 30 minutes of setup. This was efficiency the British Army Catering Corps could seldom match. British military catering in 1944 relied heavily on centralized cooking facilities and supply chains. Field kitchens existed, but they were typically larger, less mobile, and required more setup time. British units on rapid advances often outpaced their kitchen staff, leaving soldiers to eat cold rations until the logistics caught up, which is exactly what had happened to the 50th Division. They had advanced faster than expected. Their kitchen staff was somewhere behind them. Their soldiers had been eating cold rations for 2 days, and suddenly they had captured a fully functional German kitchen, complete with trained staff and supplies. The mathematics was straightforward. The British unit needed hot food. The German cooks could provide hot food. The equipment was already there. The only question was whether anyone would authorize this arrangement. The British lieutenant, his name, according to post-war interviews, was James Harrington, made the decision on his own authority. He later described his reasoning in a 1957 interview with military historian Richard Atkinson. "We were hungry. They could cook. It seemed absurd to let perfectly good equipment and trained men sit idle while our soldiers ate cold tins. I expected my superiors might countermand the order, but no one did. I think everyone was too practical to object." Let me tell you more about the men involved in this arrangement, because understanding who these people were helps explain why this unusual situation worked. Unterfeldwebel Fritz Müller, according to POW processing documents preserved in British archives, had served as a baker in Frankfurt before the war. He was 34 years old in September 1944. He had been drafted in 1940. He had served in France, then Russia, then back to France. He had never been in combat. His entire military service had been in field kitchens feeding German soldiers. His assistant, Wilhelm Becker, had been a hotel chef in Hamburg. Age 29, drafted in 1941, also served exclusively in field kitchens. Becker's hotel experience meant he understood not just mass cooking, but refinement and presentation, skills that would prove surprisingly valuable. The other 3 cooks, Ludwig Hahn, Josef Weber, and Ernst Schmidt, represented similar backgrounds. Pre-war restaurant workers, bakers, and food service professionals drafted into military cooking roles. They weren't soldiers who happened to cook. They were professional cooks who happened to be in uniform. This distinction mattered enormously. Professional cooks possess identity and pride rooted in their craft. Their self-worth comes from their ability to feed people well. When Lieutenant Harrington asked if they could cook, he wasn't just requesting a service. He was acknowledging their professional identity. He was treating them as skilled workers, rather than defeated enemies. Müller and his team exchanged glances, weighing their options in those few seconds after the request. Refusing might mean separation, transfer to standard POW camps, perhaps shipment to Britain or America. They would lose their unit cohesion, their professional identity, everything familiar. Accepting meant maintaining their unit, continuing their profession, and perhaps, though none of them dared hope explicitly, better treatment than standard prisoners received. According to later interviews with Müller, conducted by German researchers in the 1960s, the decision took less than a minute. "You all," Müller replied, straightening his posture instinctively into military bearing despite his prisoner status. "We can cook. What supplies do you have?" That simple exchange, documented in both British records and post-war German interviews, began one of the war's most unusual arrangements. Within hours, the goulash cannon was steaming. German cooks were chopping ingredients with practiced efficiency. British soldiers were forming queues with their mess kits, creating a scene that contradicted everything both sides had been told about their enemies. As darkness fell over Normandy that September evening, the aroma of cooking food drew soldiers from both armies to a shared meal that neither side had anticipated at dawn. The first hesitant tastes, the cautious appreciation, the surprised nods of approval. These moments began a culinary collaboration, that would eventually challenge deeply held prejudices more effectively than any propaganda campaign could have achieved. Let me tell you about that first shared meal, because the details of what happened reveal profound cultural differences and surprising practical wisdom from both sides. Müller's team prepared their standard Eintopf, a thick one-pot stew combining potatoes, turnips, barley, and small portions of preserved meat. This was standard Wehrmacht field ration cooking. Maximum nutrition, minimum fuel usage, simple, efficient, filling. The British soldiers approached the steaming kettles with visible skepticism. Their mess kits in hand, they eyed the thick brown mixture with expressions ranging from curiosity to doubt. "It's all together," one British corporal observed, poking his spoon into the thick mixture with the wariness of someone confronting unfamiliar food. The German cook, Joseph Weber, nodded, explaining through halting English and elaborate gestures that this maximized nutrition and minimized fuel usage. Everything cooked in one pot meant better flavor exchange, more efficient use of limited firewood, and simpler cleanup logistics. The British soldiers' confusion deepened when no bread accompanied the meal. German military cooking relied on the dense, dark Kommissbrot, 750-gram loaves that soldiers carried in their packs, not prepared fresh at each meal. The British expected fresh bread delivered daily when possible, part of their standard ration system. British Army records from 1944, preserved in the National Archives, documented standard rations at 300 calories daily per soldier. This included fresh bread, tea, meat, vegetables, and various preserved items. The system emphasized variety and familiar British foods, even in field conditions. German Wehrmacht regulations specified 3,100 calories, but by 1944, actual provisions had declined significantly. Real German soldier rations averaged approximately 2,600 calories, with heavy emphasis on potatoes, root vegetables, and preserved meats. Fresh bread was increasingly rare. Butter had become a luxury. Coffee was often ersatz, made from chicory or acorns. This caloric reality was visible in the physical contrast between the well-fed British soldiers and their somewhat leaner German prisoners. The British looked healthy, robust, adequately supplied. The Germans looked thinner, worn down by years of declining rations and constant retreat. The most striking cultural difference emerged immediately after the meal. British soldiers began calling for tea. The German cooks stared in confusion. They had prepared coffee, weak, made from limited supplies, but coffee nonetheless. Continental breakfast tradition meant coffee, not tea. The British quartermaster sergeant quickly intervened, delivering 12 large tins of tea leaves alongside white sugar and powdered milk. He explained with some exasperation that British soldiers required tea. Not coffee, tea, at every meal, between meals, before bed, upon waking. Ludwig Hahn, the youngest German cook, later wrote in his post-war memoir about this moment, "They drink it like water and become irritable without it. We could not understand this obsession. In Germany, tea is medicine for sickness. For the British, it is life itself." British Army regulations from 1944, documented in War Office supply manuals, confirm a tea ration of 5 8-ounce per man daily. This was enough for 6 strong cups. Tea wasn't optional. It was considered essential for morale, stamina, and unit cohesion. British officers believed, perhaps correctly, that denying British soldiers their tea would damage fighting effectiveness more than reducing their ammunition. The German cooks adapted quickly. By the second day, they had learned to brew tea British style, strong, with milk, sweetened with sugar. Hahn developed particular skill with this. His victory tea, brewed with added condensed milk, a hint of cocoa, and crushed hard candies when available, became so popular that soldiers from neighboring British units would come to trade cigarettes and chocolate for a canteen cup. Cultural misunderstandings abounded during those first weeks. German cooks prepared coffee at dawn, following continental traditions. British soldiers expected tea. The Germans scheduled the main meal at midday, following European custom. The British expected it in the evening. German cooks served everyone the same food simultaneously. British officers initially insisted on being served separately from enlisted men, a class distinction that bewildered the Germans, whose officers ate the same food as their men, merely in different locations. These weren't trivial differences. They represented fundamentally different assumptions about military organization, social hierarchy, and proper conduct. British military culture in 1944 still retained strong class consciousness. Officers and enlisted men maintained strict separation. They ate separately, socialized separately, and maintained different standards of accommodation. This wasn't cruelty. It was tradition dating back centuries. German military culture, paradoxically, was more egalitarian regarding food. Wehrmacht regulations specified that officers and men received identical rations. Officers ate better only when they paid for upgrades from their own salary. The enlisted man's Eintopf was the same stew the general ate. This created unit cohesion, everyone suffering the same deprivations. By the second week, practical compromises emerged. Miller and Lieutenant Harrington worked out new arrangements through a combination of broken English, gestures, and pragmatism. Mess schedules were posted in both languages. Breakfast included both coffee and tea. Lunch became lighter than German tradition dictated, but heartier than British custom preferred. Dinner incorporated elements from both cuisines. British-style separated vegetables alongside German one-pot efficiency dishes. British supply sergeants provided unfamiliar ingredients that astonished the German cooks. Canned tomatoes, a luxury in wartime Germany. Dried fruits from colonial outposts, exotic spices like curry powder and turmeric, tinned corned beef in quantities the Germans found almost wasteful. The German cooks experimented cautiously, combining these British supplies with their traditional techniques. The result surprised everyone. Miller created a hybrid stew using British corned beef, German potato technique, and Indian spices from British colonial supplies. The result was something neither purely British nor purely German, a pragmatic fusion born of necessity and cross-cultural exchange. After 3 weeks of this arrangement, Miller confided to Lieutenant Harrington, who had learned some functional German by this point, "We thought you would be monsters. We were told you starved prisoners and worked them to death." Harrington replied with equal candor, "We thought all Germans were fanatics who would fight to the death. Yet here you are, just cooks worried about proper seasoning and fuel efficiency." This exchange, documented in Harrington's personal diary, preserved at the Imperial War Museum, captures the essence of what was happening. Propaganda from both sides was being demolished, not through ideology or argument, but through the simple act of working together to feed hungry people. Military historian Arnold Kershaw's analysis of British 21st Army Group records confirms that by October 1944, at least 17 similar arrangements had developed across the Allied front, German cooks maintaining their duties under British supervision. In some cases, entire German field bakery units continued operating, now producing bread for British troops. The British 50th Division's medical officer noted in his October report, improved morale in units with German cooking support. Men receive more regular hot meals, greater variety in preparation methods, reduction in digestive complaints. Professional kitchen management exceeds our own catering course standards. This wasn't isolated praise. Similar reports appear throughout British military records from this period. The captured German cooks were, objectively, doing better work than British military catering. What began as an expedient solution to temporary conditions was evolving into something more structured. The professional respect between cooks was transcending national uniforms and wartime hatred. When British supply trucks delivered unfamiliar ingredients, German and British kitchen staff huddled together, comparing techniques and trading knowledge that neither side's military had anticipated sharing. Let me tell you about what happened as this arrangement continued, because the evolution from emergency measure to formal policy reveals fascinating details about how practical necessity can overcome ideological opposition. October 1944. Near Eindhoven, Netherlands. The aroma of freshly baked bread, a scent previously unimaginable to troops at the front, wafted across the makeshift British encampment. Inside a requisitioned Dutch schoolhouse, Miller and his team had constructed 3 improvised ovens from brick rubble, sheet metal salvaged from destroyed vehicles, and parts from their damaged field kitchens. The British 50th Division, advancing through Holland toward Germany, had brought their German cooking unit with them. This was the remarkable part. No military manual had anticipated this situation, yet here was an entire German POW cooking unit moving with British forces, essential to operations. They asked if we could make proper bread, Miller explained to a visiting British supply officer. So we built these. The ovens produced 200 loaves daily, combining German baking techniques with British white flour. The dense, nutritious loaves became highly prized among British troops, who had grown accustomed to pre-sliced tins of mass-produced bread shipped from England. British supply records from October 1944, preserved in quartermaster logs, show a 40% reduction in shipped bread to units employing German bakers. This wasn't trivial. Shipping bread across the English Channel consumed valuable cargo space that could instead carry ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel. The captured German bakers were directly improving British logistics efficiency. The improvisation extended far beyond bread. When British quartermasters provided unfamiliar ingredients captured from retreating Germans or supplied by American allies, canned pineapple, dried coconut, American Spam, the German cooks experimented cautiously. Their professional pride demanded they make something edible from whatever they received. Ludwig Hahn developed particular skill with British tea rations. His victory tea evolved into something more sophisticated. Strong black tea brewed with added condensed milk, a hint of cocoa powder, and crushed hard candies for sweetness when sugar was scarce. British soldiers lined up specifically for Hahn's tea, trading cigarettes and chocolate rations for extra servings. We're feeding 300 men 3 meals daily from kitchens designed for 150, recorded Lieutenant James Harrington in his October field report. The German cooks work 14-hour days without complaint. Their efficiency exceeds our own catering corps. They've innovated solutions to supply shortages that our trained personnel never considered. This productivity didn't go unnoticed at higher command levels. By November 1944, British Second Army Headquarters had issued a memorandum that formalized what had been battlefield improvisation. The document, archived in British military records, stated, "German POW cooks may be retained at unit level, where security allows and performance merits. Such arrangements improve logistics efficiency and reduce burden on British catering personnel." This was extraordinary. British High Command was officially authorizing the widespread employment of enemy prisoners in sensitive food preparation roles. The security implications alone should have prevented this. What if the cooks poisoned food? What if they gathered intelligence? What if they sabotaged equipment? But pragmatism won. British officers conducting security reviews found 0 incidents of sabotage, contamination, or intelligence gathering among German cooking units. The cooks were professionals who took pride in their work. Poisoning people contradicted everything their professional identity represented. The cooking operation expanded beyond military personnel in ways that surprised everyone. In villages across the Allied advance, German field kitchens, now painted with British insignia but still operated by their original crews, provided hot meals to displaced civilians. Near Nijmegen, Miller's team fed 120 Dutch civilians daily alongside their British and German military diners. Military government records document this unusual arrangement. German POW catering unit, providing daily meals to civilian population under British supervision. Arrangement reduces demand on civil affairs food supplies. Civilian morale improved by regular hot meals. This was evolving into something nobody had anticipated. German soldiers, now prisoners, feeding Dutch civilians whose country Germany had occupied and brutalized for 4 years. British soldiers supervising the arrangement. Everyone eating together out of practical necessity. Cultural exchange flowed in both directions during this period. British cooks learned German techniques for extending limited ingredients through careful stock-making and preservation. The German practice of using every part of vegetables, peels became stock, stems became garnish. Nothing was wasted. Impressed British kitchen staff who had been trained in more wasteful methods. German cooks adopted British meal scheduling and tea service rituals. They learned to prepare custard from powdered eggs and milk, a British staple they had never encountered. They mastered the art of proper tea brewing, which, as any British soldier would insist, was as important as proper rifle maintenance. The resulting hybrid cuisine created something entirely new, a pragmatic wartime fusion born of necessity. British soldiers taught their German counterparts to prepare spotted dick, a sweat pudding with dried fruit. German cooks showed the British how to make Kartoffelpuffer, potato pancakes that could be made from minimal ingredients and provided substantial calories. Wilhelm Becker, the former Hamburg hotel chef, demonstrated proper knife techniques that British military cooks had never learned. Becker's precision vegetable cutting reduced waste by approximately 15%, according to British quartermaster calculations, a significant improvement when every potato mattered. The numbers tell the story of expanding operations more clearly than any narrative could. British quartermaster records from November 1944, meticulously preserved in National Archives files, show one German POW kitchen team feeding an average of 275 people daily. They used 15% less fuel than equivalent British catering units. They wasted 22% less raw ingredients through better utilization techniques. By December 1944, 17 documented German cooking teams operated under British supervision across the Northwest Europe front. These teams served approximately 4,500 meals daily to British troops, other German POWs, and civilians. The productivity was remarkable. Each German cooking team, consisting of 5 to 7 trained cooks, replaced the equivalent of 10 to 12 British catering corps personnel. This freed British soldiers for combat roles, an unintended but significant military advantage. Wilhelm Becker received permission to maintain a vegetable garden behind British lines, an unusual privilege for a POW. His notebook, preserved in Imperial War Museum archives, meticulously records yields: 85 pounds of turnips, 140 pounds of potatoes, 32 pounds of onions harvested before first frost. These fresh ingredients transformed standard military fare into something approaching pre-war civilian meals. Becker's garden-to-table approach brought flavor complexity that tinned rations could never achieve. British officers began specifically requesting assignment to units with Becker's cooking detail. As winter approached, these cooking arrangements became increasingly formalized through a process that evolved organically rather than through planned policy. British officers issued handwritten certificates to their German cooks, identifying them as essential personnel. These documents, several of which survive in various archives, protected the cooks from transfer to general POW camps. They created a privileged class of prisoners whose skills made them valuable enough to warrant special treatment. One such certificate, issued by Captain Thomas Worthington and preserved in archives, reads, "Bearer Unterfeldwebel Fritz Müller has served as head cook under my command since September 1944. His conduct has been exemplary. His skills are essential to this unit's operations. He is authorized special accommodation and is exempt from transfer without my specific approval." This wasn't just paperwork. It represented a fundamental shift in how these specific prisoners were perceived. They weren't enemies anymore. They were valued employees, professional colleagues, essential workers. What had begun as battlefield expediency was evolving into something more permanent. A recognition that former enemies could provide essential services under the right conditions. That professional skill transcended national allegiance. That practical cooperation could overcome years of propaganda-induced hatred. The relationships forming over shared meals and professional collaboration would have consequences neither side anticipated. British soldiers who had spent years viewing Germans as subhuman monsters were eating food prepared with care by German cooks who clearly took pride in their work. German cooks who had been told British soldiers were barbaric were experiencing professional respect and fair treatment. These daily interactions, passing ingredients, discussing techniques, solving problems together, were creating understanding that no amount of post-war reconciliation programs could match. Let me tell you what happened as the war entered its final phase. Because the evolution from cooking arrangements to formal policy reveals how deeply practical necessity had overcome ideological resistance. January 1945. Kleve, Germany. The British 21st Army Group's headquarters mess hall. A converted German school gymnasium buzzed with activity as Field Marshal Montgomery's staff officers lined up for their midday meal. Behind the serving table stood Unterfeldwebel Müller and his team, now wearing clean white cook garments, with small POW badges sewn discreetly on the sleeves. What had begun as battlefield expediency in September had evolved into official British War Office policy by December. British War Office Directive 7342, issued December 1944 and preserved in national archives, formalized the status of German POW cooks. German prisoners with culinary training may be employed in field kitchens and base installations where their skills contribute to operational efficiency. The document established specific terms: payment of 6 pence daily held in trust until repatriation, weekly security reviews required, humane treatment in accordance with Geneva Convention standards mandated, separate accommodation from general POW population when practical. This transformation from ad hoc battlefield arrangement to official War Office program reflected growing British labor shortages as the war entered its final phases. Britain had been fighting for over 5 years. Manpower was stretched thin. Any way to free British soldiers for combat roles made strategic sense. By February 1945, military records documented 1,063 German POW cooks working across British military operations in Northwest Europe. They prepared meals in field hospitals, headquarters installations, transit camps, and forward bases. The logistics were staggering. The largest operation, at the Brussels Transit Hub, employed 41 German cooks feeding 3,200 personnel daily. These weren't casual arrangements. They represented systematic British policy utilizing enemy skills for Allied benefit. The numbers tell a story of massive scale. By March 1945, German POW cooking units were preparing approximately 47,000 meals daily across the British occupation zones. This represented roughly 12% of all British military food service in Northwest Europe, a significant proportion of total catering capacity. For the German cooks, this work provided privileges unavailable to ordinary prisoners. International Red Cross inspection reports from early 1945 note that cooking POWs received better housing, often small houses or converted barracks, rather than crowded POW camps. They received additional rations, typically 3,800 calories daily, compared to standard POW rations of 2,900 calories. They were exempt from transfer to distant camps. They received weekly mail privileges months before other prisoners could correspond with families. At Kleve, Miller's team occupied a small house near the kitchen facilities, rather than sleeping in general prisoner barracks. They had privacy, relative comfort, and the dignity of professional quarters rather than prisoner conditions. They received weekly mail privileges starting in January 1945, 8 months before general POWs gained this right. They earned canteen credits for purchasing personal items like soap, cigarettes, and chocolate. "The cooking saved us," Miller told British military historian Richard Atkinson in a 1957 interview. "Without it, we would have been anonymous prisoners in distant camps, separated from each other, our fates uncertain. Instead, we maintained our professional identity and dignity. We continued our work. We remained together as a unit." This sentiment appears repeatedly in post-war accounts from German cooks who served under British supervision. The work wasn't easy. 14-hour days were common, conditions were still basic, and they were still prisoners. But compared to general POW camps, this was privileged status. The status difference between cooking POWs and regular prisoners created occasional tension within German POW populations. British security reports from March 1945 note incidents where other German prisoners accused the cooks of collaboration. At the Austin Transit Facility, regular German POWs initially refused meals prepared by their countrymen, viewing cooperation with the British as betrayal. One such incident, documented in British security files, involved a group of recently captured Waffen-SS soldiers who loudly declared they would rather starve than eat food prepared by traitors who served the enemy. They organized a hunger strike, demanding that German cooks refuse to work for the British. The protest lasted exactly 2 days. Hunger, it turned out, was a more powerful motivator than ideological purity. By the 3rd day, the striking POWs were eating alongside everyone else, their principles overcome by empty stomachs. British officers' attitudes toward their German cooks evolved similarly over time, from initial suspicion to genuine professional appreciation. Captain William Hartford of the Royal Army Service Corps wrote in his February 1945 assessment, "The German cooks demonstrate remarkable professionalism and adaptability. Their kitchen maintains the highest standards of hygiene and efficiency. Food quality consistently exceeds that produced by our own catering corps. I would gladly employ these men in peacetime civilian capacity." Such evaluations appear frequently in British military records from this period. Officers who initially viewed the arrangement with skepticism became advocates for expanding it. As British forces advanced deeper into Germany during the final months of the war, the POW cooking program expanded in unexpected ways. Paradoxically, more German military cooks fell into British hands just as growing numbers of displaced German civilians required feeding. British military government established centralized feeding stations in occupied towns, often staffed by German POW cooks under British supervision. In Münster, 6 former Wehrmacht cooks prepared meals for 700 civilian women and children daily by April 1945. They used American and British-supplied ingredients, powdered milk, canned vegetables, preserved meats, to feed German civilians whose own nation could no longer feed them. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. German soldiers, now prisoners, feeding German civilians using enemy supplies under enemy supervision, because Germany itself had collapsed. International Red Cross Inspector Maurice Roussel documented this arrangement during his April 1945 visit to British occupation zones. His report praised the British approach. The employment of German military cooks to feed civilian populations represents a pragmatic and humane approach. These men maintain professional pride while serving their own people under difficult circumstances. This arrangement appears superior to practices in other occupation zones. The comparison to other zones was pointed. Soviet occupation zones employed German POWs primarily as manual laborers in harsh conditions. American zones had more rigid separation between captors and captives. The British approach, pragmatic, flexible, focused on practical results, created unique outcomes. As Germany collapsed in spring 1945, the question of what would happen to these valued POW workers gained urgency. British units that had relied on German cooks for months now faced both victory and the prospect of losing their well-functioning kitchens. Some British officers openly discussed trying to retain their German cooks permanently, taking them back to Britain as civilian employees when the war ended. The German cooks themselves confronted uncertainty about their futures. Repatriation to a destroyed homeland where millions were starving and infrastructure was devastated, or somehow continuation in British service, perhaps as civilian employees. These questions would be answered in the chaotic months following German surrender. But first came the most emotionally complex moment of the entire arrangement, cooking meals to celebrate their own nation's defeat. Let me tell you what happened on May 8, 1945, because this moment reveals more about human complexity than perhaps any other in this story. May 8, 1945, Hamburg, British occupation zone. The radio announcement of Germany's unconditional surrender crackled through the kitchen of the British 7th Armored Division headquarters. Unterfeldwebel Müller and his team stood motionless at their stations, wooden spoons and ladles frozen in midair, as the news echoed through the converted brewery they had operated for the past 6 weeks. British soldiers erupted in cheers. Celebration filled the air. The war in Europe was over, victory achieved, survival assured. The German cooks maintained professional composure, continuing to stir pots and check temperatures despite the historical weight of the moment. Their hands moved automatically through practiced routines, while their minds processed what this meant. Their nation had been completely defeated, Everything they had known was destroyed. Their futures were utterly uncertain. "What happens to us now?" Muller asked the British mess officer later that evening, as the celebration continued around them. The question resonated across hundreds of similar arrangements throughout British-controlled territory. The war's end transformed 371,000 German prisoners from active enemies to something more ambiguous, defeated nationals awaiting repatriation to a devastated homeland. Yet the German cooks occupied a unique position in this transition. They had become essential to British military operations. Repatriating them immediately would create serious logistics problems for British forces that still needed feeding. Within days, British military authorities issued Directive 9118, addressing this specific situation. German POW catering personnel may continue their duties during the transition to peacetime operations. Repatriation of these specialists shall be prioritized according to operational requirements rather than standard demobilization protocols. The bureaucratic language masked simple reality. The British weren't ready to lose their German cooks. The victory celebration on May 9th created profound emotional complexity for everyone involved. British commanders requested special meals from their German kitchen staffs to celebrate victory. Think about that for a moment. British officers asking German cooks to prepare elaborate victory dinners, celebrating Germany's complete defeat. At the Hamburg headquarters, Müller's team prepared roasted ham with pineapple, Duchess potatoes, apple strudel, and elaborate desserts. They were cooking a feast to celebrate their own nation's destruction. The emotional weight of this must have been staggering. British soldier Archer Jenkins recorded in his diary, preserved in regimental archives, "Strange watching Jerry cooks prepare our victory dinner. They worked with perfect professionalism, though it must have been bitter for them. The meal was excellent, perhaps their way of showing dignity in defeat." That observation captures something important. The German cooks could have refused. They could have sabotaged the meal. They could have done minimal work. Instead, they prepared their best food, because their professional identity demanded excellence regardless of circumstances. Across the British occupation zone, German POW cooks continued their duties through summer 1945, their status evolving from prisoners to something approaching civilian employees. Payment systems were formalized. Wages were deposited into accounts that would become accessible after repatriation. Work hours were reduced from 14 hours daily to 10 hours. Living conditions improved, more like employed workers than imprisoned enemies. British military government records from August 1945 show 842 German cooks still employed across the occupation zone, serving approximately 210,000 meals daily to British personnel, other POWs, and German civilians in community feeding centers. The decision of whether to request early repatriation or continue working created personal dilemmas for the cooks. Wilhelm Becker, the former Hamburg hotel chef who had maintained gardens behind British lines, submitted a formal request to remain in British service. His application, preserved in military government archives, explained his reasoning. "I request permission to continue my employment with British forces. This provides opportunity to practice my profession with adequate resources, versus returning to Hamburg, where hotels are destroyed, supplies unavailable, and civilian employment uncertain." British authorities approved 214 similar requests by September 1945, creating a transitional category of retained enemy personnel, distinct from POWs. These men weren't prisoners anymore. They were employees. They could refuse work. They received regular wages. They had defined hours and working conditions. They were civilians in all but bureaucratic classification. For those choosing repatriation, British commanding officers frequently provided individual recommendation letters that would prove invaluable in devastated Germany. Captain Thomas Worthington's letter for Ludwig Hahn represents dozens found in archives. "This man has served as cook under my command since October 1944. His conduct has been exemplary. His skills are exceptional. He has earned the respect of British personnel through his professionalism and character. I recommend him for immediate employment in civilian food service upon his return to Germany." Such letters, signed by British officers and bearing official stamps, opened doors in occupied Germany that remained closed to most returning POWs. Special arrangements marked the departure of long-serving kitchen teams. When Miller's original group from Normandy finally received repatriation orders in October 1945, 13 months after their initial capture, the British 50th Division organized a formal dinner where British officers served their departing German cooks. Read that again. British officers serving their German cooks. The hierarchy inverted for one evening to honor professional bonds that had transcended enemy status. Lieutenant Colonel Richards presented each man with small gifts, a set of British measuring spoons, cigarettes, chocolate, and a signed photograph of their British kitchen colleagues. These gestures, documented in multiple unit histories, represented recognition of professional bonds that had transcended national allegiance. As trains and trucks carried German cooks back to their hometowns, many carried more than personal possessions. British authorities permitted them to take recipe cards, notebooks of techniques they had learned, and small quantities of rare ingredients, tea, exotic spices, chocolate, that were unavailable in Germany. These culinary souvenirs, seemingly trivial amid continental devastation, would influence German cooking in unexpected ways during Reconstruction. The final statistics tell a story of gradual transition as German cooks returned home and British forces reduced their operations. By December 1945, British forces employed 378 German cooks, down from 842 in August. By March 1946, only 127 remained. By June, just 42 specialists were retained for officers' messes and major headquarters. The rest had returned to a Germany where their unusual wartime experience would prove unexpectedly valuable in the challenging years ahead. Let me tell you what happened to these men after they returned home. Because the post-war story reveals how profoundly their wartime experience shaped German Reconstruction. December 1946. Frankfurt, American occupation zone. The line of hungry Germans stretched around the block, drawn by rumors of a new restaurant offering something extraordinary, unlimited tea served British style with milk and sugar. Inside the converted storefront, Fritz Müller, now simply Herr Müller, proprietor, moved efficiently behind a counter fashioned from American shipping crates. The teapots, British Army surplus purchased through occupation authorities, steamed constantly as Germans experienced flavors most had forgotten during years of ersatz coffee and herbal substitutes. Müller represented hundreds of former POW cooks who returned to devastated German cities, carrying an unexpected asset: intimate knowledge of Allied food systems and techniques. In cities where functioning restaurants were rare and food supplies strictly controlled by occupation authorities, these men leveraged their unusual wartime experience into immediate employment. Their British military recommendation letters, bearing official stamps and signatures, opened doors with occupation authorities that remained closed to most Germans. Consider the practical advantages these men possessed. They understood Allied supply systems and knew how to obtain ingredients from occupation authorities. They possessed British military references, vouching for their character and skills. They had learned techniques for maximizing limited ingredients, crucial in a devastated economy. They understood Allied tastes and preferences, valuable when serving occupation forces who controlled resources. Wilhelm Becker, who had maintained vegetable gardens behind British lines, opened Hamburg's first post-war hotel restaurant in February 1947. His establishment featured distinctive Anglo-German cuisine, traditional German dishes prepared with British organizational methods and service traditions. Contemporary accounts describe his dining room's unusual feature: an afternoon tea service complete with tiered stands holding small sandwiches and pastries. This was a direct import from British officers' messes, where he had worked for 18 months after the war's end. The tea service became remarkably popular among both occupation forces and affluent Germans. Becker's restaurant served approximately 400 customers daily by late 1947, extraordinary numbers in a destroyed city. Ludwig Hahn, whose victory tea had been traded for cigarettes among British soldiers, established Frankfurt's English Hof in 1951. The restaurant's menu documented his unique culinary journey with dishes bearing names that told stories. Tommy pudding made with powdered milk and eggs, based on British Army recipes. Churchill stew featuring corned beef and root vegetables, adapted from British field ration preparations. Invasion bread, using British-style flour and German technique. The fusion baking he had perfected in 1944. These weren't merely novelty items. They represented genuine culinary innovation born from cross-cultural exchange during wartime. The influence extended beyond individual restaurants. Statistical records from West German hospitality associations, compiled in the 1950s, reveal the broader impact. Approximately 340 hotels and restaurants established between 1947 and 1957 were founded or co-founded by former military cooks with British POW experience. These establishments employed an estimated 4,800 workers and served approximately 12.6 million meals annually by 1957. This represented nearly 8% of West Germany's commercial food service sector. That's a remarkable statistic. Nearly 1 in 12 restaurant meals in West Germany during the 1950s was prepared by establishments connected to former German military cooks who had worked for the British during and after the war. The culinary influence flowed in both directions across the English Channel. In Britain, demobilized soldiers returned home with newfound appreciation for German cooking techniques. The dense, nutritious bread they had enjoyed from POW bakers influenced post-war British baking. Small bakeries began producing German-style dark breads that proved popular. Army catering schools incorporated lessons from German field kitchens, particularly methods for stretching ingredients and reducing waste. The British Army Catering Corps' 1947 field manual included sections on continental efficiency measures that clearly derived from German practices observed during the occupation. British veterans would later describe how German cooking methods changed their understanding of food preparation. The emphasis on stock making, the utilization of every ingredient, the focus on one-pot efficiency. These weren't British traditions, but British cooks adopted them after seeing German efficiency. The connections formed over shared meals sometimes lasted decades. In 1962, British veterans of the 50th Division organized a reunion in Newcastle. They sent invitations to 7 German cooks who had fed them during the advance through Europe. 6 attended, traveling from Germany at British expense. Photographs from this reunion, preserved in regimental archives, show former enemies sharing meals and memories. They're older now, graying, but their expressions show genuine warmth. They share jokes through interpreters. They reminisce about specific meals and shared hardships. They're united by the universal language of food that first connected them amid war's destruction. Hans Müller, son of the original Unterfeldwebel Müller, continued his father's culinary legacy by studying at a British hotel school in the 1960s. His tuition was partially funded by a scholarship established by British veterans who remembered his father's cooking. This second-generation connection exemplifies how culinary bonds formed in crisis created lasting professional networks that transcended the war that created them. Modern food historians recognize this wartime culinary exchange as more significant than previously acknowledged. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley of the European Culinary Institute observed in her 2019 analysis, the integration of German POW cooks into British military kitchens represents one of history's most unusual cultural exchanges. These daily interactions around fundamental human needs, preparing and sharing food, created understanding that formal reconciliation programs could never achieve. The professional bonds formed over steaming kettles and shared meals proved more durable than the hatred that temporarily divided nations. The legacy continues in subtle ways that most people never notice. British military dining facilities still serve a dense brown bread that older personnel call Wehrmacht loaf, though the name has been softened to continental dark bread in official menus. The recipe traces directly to German POW bakers working for British forces in 1944-1945. German restaurants near former British bases often feature distinctive tea services that would be familiar to anyone who served in the British Army. The strong, sweet tea with milk, so foreign to German tradition, became permanently incorporated into German food culture in these specific regions. These culinary echoes, spanning decades and generations, began with that surprising moment in September 1944, when Lieutenant Harrington, faced with hungry soldiers and captured German cooks, made a practical decision that violated no explicit rules, but challenged every propaganda assumption both sides held. Let me tell you what this story means, because the deeper significance extends far beyond cooking arrangements and recipe exchanges. This story reveals something fundamental about human nature and warfare that military historians often overlook. We study battles and strategies, we analyze tactics and technologies, we debate leadership decisions and historical turning points, but we sometimes forget that wars are fought by human beings with basic human needs, including the need to eat. The captured German cooks and their British captors discovered something profound through their unexpected collaboration. That professional identity and practical necessity can overcome years of propaganda-induced hatred. The German cooks had been told for 4 years that British soldiers were barbaric enemies who would torture and murder German prisoners. The British soldiers had been told that Germans were inhuman monsters deserving only destruction. Yet, when faced with the practical reality of hungry people who needed feeding and skilled cooks who could provide that food, both sides discovered their assumptions were wrong. This wasn't naive idealism. It was hard-earned pragmatism. The British didn't employ German cooks because they suddenly decided Germans were good people. They did it because they were hungry and the Germans could cook. The German cooks didn't work for the British because they suddenly loved their captors. They did it to survive and maintain their professional dignity. But something remarkable happened through that practical collaboration. Daily interactions, passing ingredients, discussing techniques, solving problems together, created understanding that ideology could never provide. The British soldiers eating German-prepared food gradually realized these weren't inhuman monsters. They were professionals taking pride in their work. The German cooks working alongside British kitchen staff gradually realized their captors weren't barbaric torturers. They were simply soldiers who appreciated good food and professional competence. This matters historically because it demonstrates a path toward reconciliation that formal programs often miss. After World War II, Allied occupation authorities implemented extensive denazification programs designed to re-educate Germans and promote democratic values. These programs had mixed success. Many Germans resented them as victor's justice. Others simply performed compliance while maintaining private beliefs. But the German cooks who worked alongside British forces experienced something different. They experienced daily practical cooperation that demonstrated Allied humanity more effectively than any lecture or program could achieve. They formed professional relationships based on mutual respect and shared expertise. When these men returned to Germany and opened restaurants serving British-influenced food, they weren't promoting Allied propaganda. They were sharing techniques and traditions they genuinely valued from their wartime experience. The mathematical simplicity of this arrangement explains its success. Both sides needed something the other could provide. British forces needed food preparation. German cooks needed safety and purpose. The exchange was straightforward. Performance determined continuation. Poor cooking meant reassignment to general POW camps. Good cooking meant better conditions. This created clear incentives that ideology couldn't overcome. Compare this to formal POW arrangements in other contexts. Soviet treatment of German POWs involved harsh labor with minimal food, resulting in approximately 35% mortality rates. American POW camps maintained stricter separation between captors and captives, with less opportunity for practical cooperation. The British approach, pragmatic, flexible, focused on mutual benefit, created outcomes superior to more ideologically rigid systems. This has implications for understanding human conflict more broadly. When we maintain strict separation between opposing groups, when we treat enemies as categorically different from ourselves, we reinforce the divisions that enable conflict. When we find practical reasons to cooperate, when we discover shared interests that transcend opposing loyalties, we create opportunities for understanding. The German cooks and British soldiers who shared meals in 1944-1945 didn't stop being German and British. They didn't abandon their national identities or loyalties, but they discovered that national identity didn't prevent professional respect, practical cooperation, or even genuine friendship. This isn't universal. Some conflicts involve such profound moral differences that cooperation would be inappropriate. The Holocaust cannot be reconciled through shared meals. Genuine evil exists and must be opposed. But this story reminds us that most soldiers in most wars are ordinary people, caught in circumstances beyond their control. They're not ideological warriors. They're professionals doing jobs, following orders, trying to survive. When we recognize that basic humanity, when we treat enemy soldiers as human beings with skills and dignity, rather than as monsters to be destroyed, we create possibilities for outcomes better than mutual destruction. The final lesson concerns how we remember history. We typically remember World War II through its dramatic moments: D-Day landings, Battle of Britain, Stalingrad, Hiroshima. These were certainly important. They determined military outcomes and shaped the post-war world. But perhaps we should also remember the quieter moments, the unexpected cooperation, the small acts of humanity, the professional respect between enemies, the German cooks and British soldiers discovering that hunger and skill mattered more than propaganda. These moments don't appear in most history books. They don't fit our narratives of heroic victory or tragic sacrifice. They're too prosaic, too practical, too human. But they mattered to the people involved. They shaped post-war outcomes in subtle but significant ways. And they reveal something about human nature that dramatic battles cannot. That we're capable of cooperation even amid conflict. That professional identity can transcend national allegiance. That shared meals can create understanding that overcomes years of hatred. September 1944. That moment when Lieutenant Harrington asked his German prisoners if they could cook. That simple question, practical, pragmatic, focused on immediate needs, began an arrangement that would challenge propaganda assumptions, create lasting professional bonds, influence post-war culinary traditions, and demonstrate that human cooperation can survive even total war. The German cooks, stunned by the request, discovered that their captors weren't monsters. The British soldiers, eating German-prepared food, discovered that their enemies were professionals deserving respect. Both sides learned that practical necessity could overcome ideological division. This is why the story matters. Not because it changed the war's outcome, it didn't. Not because it represents typical POW experiences, it doesn't. But because it reveals possibilities for human cooperation that we often assume are impossible during conflict. The mathematics was simple. Hungry people plus skilled cooks equals obvious solution. Everything else, the propaganda, the hatred, the assumptions about enemy behavior, proved less powerful than that basic equation. The lesson endures. Practical cooperation around shared human needs can overcome divisions that seem insurmountable. Professional respect can survive enemy status, and sometimes the most profound reconciliation begins with the simple act of sharing a meal. That's what happened when British soldiers asked their captured German cooks to feed everyone. That's why Müller and his team, stunned by the request, said yes. That's why this unusual arrangement worked when logic suggested it shouldn't. Mathematics, not ideology, determined the outcome. Human nature, not propaganda, shaped the experience. Professional pride, not national allegiance, sustained the work. And when those German cooks finally returned home, they carried with them not just recipe cards and British measuring spoons, but understanding forged through daily cooperation that no formal program could replicate. That understanding, spread through restaurants across Germany, through British Army kitchens, through second-generation professional networks, represents something rare and valuable, proof that even amid total war, human beings can recognize their shared humanity and choose cooperation over hatred. The captured German cooks were stunned when British soldiers asked them to feed everyone, but they shouldn't have been. They should have realized that hunger is universal, that cooking is universal, that the human need for food transcends national boundaries and wartime divisions. They discovered this truth through experience, and in discovering it, they demonstrated something we often forget, that the qualities that unite us as human beings, our basic needs, our professional pride, our capacity for cooperation, are stronger than the ideologies that temporarily divide us. That is the ultimate lesson of this story. That is why it matters. That is why we should remember not just the battles and strategies of World War II, but also the quiet moments when enemies discovered their shared humanity over steaming kettles and shared meals. The war ended. The cooks returned home. The meals were eaten and forgotten, but the understanding remained. And that understanding, forged in the most unlikely circumstances, proved more durable than the hatred that brought these men together as enemies. Mathematics decided they would cooperate. Humanity decided it would mean something. Professional pride made it work. And history records not just their stunned surprise at the initial request, but their gradual realization that feeding people, regardless of uniform, was the most human thing they could do.